Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ask GN. We're filming another one right after this for the Patreon extended version. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to get access to that. But this is the main show. So if you want to leave a question for next week, post it in the comment section below or in the Patreon Ask GN channel, and we'll try and get to it for next week's episode. This week we've got a couple of good ones. One on how much does VRM power delivery actually matter? And I took that question to our expert Buildzoid to get his quote on it. And I think that'll probably be the most interesting to a lot of you. But we also have some fun ones about things like, will GN design a case? So we'll get into that after this. Before that, this video is brought to you by Corsair's new Dark Core RGB SE mouse. The Dark Core RGB SE is a wireless gaming mouse rated for up to 24 hours of continuous wireless gaming with the LEDs enabled, and can be coupled with a Qi charging mouse pad for easy battery charging. It has both wireless and Bluetooth antenna, so the mouse can be used easily on two systems and switched between them. Learn more at the link in the description below. Quick mod mat update for everyone first. A couple of you have asked when the next round will ship. The good news, if you've back-ordered it already or you're back-ordering it soon, you will definitely get the next round of mats. We're not completely sold out of the next round yet, so you have time. store.gamersnexus.net if you're interested in it. We should be getting them shipped to us within, I think our target right now is 10 to 12-ish days, maybe 10 to 15, depending on when this video goes live. And then from there, obviously, we'll ship it out to you all. So add the usual shipping time for that if you're domestic or international. But that's your answer. It takes a while to get this stuff shipped over after it's finished production. So first real question. Gamer Games asks, Ask GN, third time asking, sorry. Keep posting below. We get a lot of comments. Does VRM power delivery matter in overclocking, e.g. 13-phase power delivery overclocks higher than 8-phase power delivery? Thanks. I have a big answer from Buildzoid. I'm going to sort of preface this by saying it depends. The question you're asking depends on all kinds of stuff, like what kind of components are you overclocking, how far are you overclocking them, and we'll get into his answer for the rest of this. So Buildzoid, from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, has got his own YouTube channel you should subscribe to if you haven't. He says, it really depends. If you ignore the thermal aspect and just look at the electrical benefits of multi-phase, you basically get this: lower ripple and faster transient response. Basically, more phases equals better voltage regulation. However, it's easier to stay in spec on a 10 amp to 20 amp jump than on a 10 amp to 100 amp jump. Also, ripple at 10 amps is lower than at 100 amps for a given set of components. Continues to say, at low currents, the electrical benefits of a multi-phase design aren't relevant because a single phase wouldn't be having issues. Once you get into very high current draws, the multi-phase designs will start showing their advantages as keeping good ripple, and I'm going to read this part in Buildzoid's voice once I get up to it, and transient on a single 100 amp phase is really, really hard to do. Though if we weren't limited by physics, you could build like a stupid high switching frequency single phase that could rival a massive multi-phase. He continues a bit by saying, I think the simplest answer is that having more phases only really helps for higher power draws, though I would recommend against overclocking on less than 4 phases, even on something like a 7600K. I think a 7350K would probably be kind of okay, or at least the i3 shouldn't clock much worse on a 3-phase compared to a 4-phase. Something like a 7700K could end up requiring much higher V-core setting to hit the same clock compared to a MOBO with more phases, or more true phases. So that's probably the best answer you're going to get. It does depend a lot. This is something I talked with Buildzoid about as well, but it depends on the CPU you're overclocking, as he indicated here with i3s, i5s, i7s. Of course, Ryzen, same thing applies. For example, if you're overclocking an 8-core Ryzen CPU versus like a 4-core, huge difference in the power requirements, in the thermal requirements, and the kind of heat that the VRM is generating. Also, again, this does depend on what you kind of consider to be your stop point for an overclock. If you're trying to do stuff like Buildzoid, then you definitely need a lot more than the average user who's trying to hit like 4.8 or 9 on the average Intel i7 chip, or 3.9, 4.0 on the average Ryzen chip. But his answer is pretty good for you, so I'm going to leave it there. Next question. Oh, and actually Hardcore Overclocking if you want to check him out. Next question is abalanceddiet, who says, if given the chance to influence the design of a piece of hardware, such as a case, would you do it? Why or why not? For example, if NZXT came up to you and said, Steve, we're looking to make a high airflow version of the S340 Elite, complete with a mesh front panel, and we'd like you to help us design it, what would you do? We've kind of talked about this before. Designing cases is really hard. I have a lot of respect for the people that do it, even when their cases aren't the most positively received by us. I still fully understand how difficult it is to make that. Because I mean, we've talked to all of these PMs and product managers over the years. I've heard the horror stories. We work with factories ourselves now on things like the mod mats, and I get it. So it is hard. That said, yes, I do think it'd be fun to work on. I don't have a design in my head right now. One day, we kind of have some completely not concrete, won't happen anytime soon, ideas of making a one-off case just to do it, just for fun. Go to like a local machine shop or call some friends with the equipment to do it and send them some designs and see what we can put together. That's not happening anytime soon. I'm not promising content on it today or even this year, but it's something I'd like to do. It's kind of like a distant content idea that I really like, and I think we could offer a bit of a unique angle on it. If a company came to me, I mean, sure, if it's kind of like Der Bauer is a good example where he worked with Lian Li to make the dynamic cases, I'd be open to it for sure. That said, it's definitely an intimidating task. Like, I've seen a lot of comments from our viewers where they're like, Steve should design a case, Jen should design a case. We could probably get the airflow side pretty well, but everything else, like the looks, that's difficult. Design ID is really hard. Maybe we'll look into it someday for fun, though. I'm certainly not going to be mass producing cases anytime soon, but it'd be fun as just like a mock it up in CAD, bring it to a machine shop or some friends who can put it together and make it and test it just to see what would happen. But yeah, sure. If a company came up to me and said, we'd like to design a case with you, I'd be like, yeah, let's do it. That sounds fun. But yeah, again, the compromises you have to make in that kind of design are challenging. And I respect what they have to go through to do it. Next, especially when you consider the cost of things. Next question, Matt the Tech says, hey Steve, I just joined Patreon to ask this question, but will be staying because I want to support my favorite tech journalist. Thank you, I appreciate it. When Precision Boost Override is turned on the 2700X, what is the T-die TJ Max of the 2700X? I can't find anything official about this. I was hoping you could investigate for us. I know with Precision Boost Override turned off, that it's supposed to be 85 degrees Celsius. Whether that's T-die or T-control, I'm not sure, but there is nothing out there that I can find about the throttle point when you have Precision Boost turned off, or on, I guess, depending. So the tricky thing here is that Ryzen doesn't throttle the same way that Intel CPUs do. And because Intel's had market share for so long, I think we've all kind of gotten used to that. For like the understanding was when a CPU hits 100 degrees or whatever TJ Max is for the CPU, then it throttles down. Whereas with GPUs, the understanding is every couple of degrees you lose a couple of megahertz because they use different boost technology. GPU Boost 3, and what even AMD does now on Vega cards, same idea. So with AMD CPUs, Ryzen CPUs, they're getting more and more like GPUs in the way they boost. Ryzen 2, just like Ryzen 1, except even more so, is really sensitive to temperature. So you could push 90 degrees on it, T-die, sure. But the stability of the overclock is going to be much worse at that point. AMD officially, just so everyone knows, their official number, I think their official number is 60.8 degrees as the optimal temperature. That doesn't mean you should buy like a 600 millimeter radiator to try and get it to be 60.8 degrees if you're like pushing a high overclock. It absolutely doesn't mean you have to run it at that temperature. But I'm just saying that was when creating their TDP numbers, the metric they use for optimal die temperature is 60.8. So that gives you a starting point. To answer the question directly, TJ Max, I think, is supposed to be about 95, but we've run CPUs that don't hard shut down at that point, and they don't throttle either. So that's the tricky point where you see Ryzen 2 CPUs, and it's not like they hit 95 or they hit 90 or 85 or whatever. They don't hit some number and just magically throttle down 300 megahertz lower like you expect with Intel. Typically what happens is you just lose boosting headroom if it's stock, including XFR2, and if it's overclocked, you lose stability. So it'll keep trying to hold that frequency, but at some point you're going to have a freeze, a blue screen, whatever, and you'll have to restart. Now, in our testing, in our experience, staying under 90 TDI helps a lot with stability, a whole lot with stability. Staying closer to 80 to 85 has proven the most stable with the lower voltages that we try to use. You can push higher voltages to maintain higher overclocks, but obviously the more voltage you push into it, the hotter it gets. So you have kind of a feedback loop where you're trying to increase stability by increasing voltage, which increases heat, which decreases stability. So that's kind of the problem you run into with it. And I don't mean problem like a design flaw. I mean problem like it's a challenge when overclocking. It works pretty well as a design. It's just, you know, you expect different things when you use different products to overclock. So to answer your question, it's about 95 is kind of the hard limit in theory, but it'll depend on the motherboard. Different motherboards will interact with TJ Max in different ways. On Intel, for example, just because I'm still the most familiar with that, because Ryzen 2 is still new. On Intel, you can hit TJ Max on a board like 100 or 105 with HEDT CPUs, and it might downclock or it might shut down. It depends on how it's configured or if you changed it for what it does when you hit TJ Max and what kind of protection you wanted. With Ryzen, like I said, it's not so much of a hard number that you hit and things downclock. Like if you have hardware monitor open or hardware info open and you're expecting to see a big downclock when you hit a certain temperature threshold, it's more likely you're just going to see a freeze or a crash than kind of temperature or thermal throttling of the frequency, except in the case of stock performance, in which case you'll see some boost limitations, but we're talking more overclocking here because that's where you're more likely to hit the higher temperatures anyway. Next question, Daniel Muñoz says, on episode 77, around the 2-minute mark, you mentioned that on Intel Hades Canyon NUC, the Vega M GPU present isn't really Vega, but it's kind of Polaris. What do you mean by this? Vega's memory controller is made... Oh, yeah, so these are my notes I want to read to you. So here's the thing. This comes down to how do you define one architecture versus the other. AMD calls it Vega. So really, at the end of the day, it is called a Vega product. It is called a Vega GPU. That's the official branding. But as for what is Vega or what is Polaris, you have to kind of draw a few lines to decide. The Vega M GPUs on the Intel NUC are a semi-custom solution. AMD worked with Intel to make this Vega branded GPU. It uses Polaris technology, it uses Vega technology, because at the end of the day, it still has a high bandwidth cache controller. It still has an HBCC. To me, that's a very definitive, this is Vega feature. HBCC is something that was really specific to Vega. It was a big deal with Vega's development early on, and that's a defining characteristic that I would point to that, and I would say that's Vega architecture. It also has HBM2, so it's got high bandwidth memory, something that Polaris does not have, although Fiji had high bandwidth memory 1, HBM with the Fury X. But Polaris clearly doesn't have HBM2, so that's a big differentiator as well. As for other stuff, there's differences of, well, like I said, Polaris uses GDDR5, GCN4 versus 4.1 to GCN5 on Vega, and you end up with a kind of just an existential question of how do you define it, because it is kind of Vega, but it's not the Vega that we expect when we talk about Vega 56 or 64. So yes, you bring up great points here in your question, but it just kind of depends on if you're using strictly AMD's marketing or you want to call it like Vega asterisk, kind of not, but kind of is. PC World has a great article on this. They kind of started talking about it. There's some other stuff out there as well. So yeah, Vega M doesn't currently have DX 12.1 support, but it could be added probably. The Vega M still has HBCC. It's got HBM2. It does not appear to have drawstream binning rasterization or rasterizers or rapid packed math, I guess. So technically, yes, those are Vega features, but we don't really see them used too often anyway. And I would call HBCC a higher echelon of Vega feature than RPM. But that's just how I kind of define it myself. Yeah, I think a couple other things were pointed out. Device ID indicates Polaris, but that's just a device ID. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. There is a high ROP count versus a low CU count, and that's pretty unique. That comes into the semi-custom design. So when I said that, what I was referring to is it's not the Vega. It's not Vega 56 or Vega 64. It's not the same thing that you think of architecturally as those, because it's got some Polaris tendencies, but it's not 100% Polaris either. It's a unique thing in between. And for the record, we really like the Hades Canyon Nook. That's probably my favorite thing I've reviewed this year, just because it's so interesting. Because Intel and AMD work together on something, and it's really good. Like, yes, it's expensive, but it's still really good hardware, and I can appreciate that in isolation of the price. And that's because they work together instead of trying to kill each other for 5 seconds, and came up with something really cool. So you end up with a semi-custom half Vega, half Polaris type of thing that Intel probably had some specification on, depending on whatever they were trying to do with the box. Next question, Rusty Shackleford says, as stupid as this is going to sound, what's the difference between HBM and GDDR memory chips? Is it because how they're manufactured, how they're programmed, or something simple like the resources that they're made from? I think this question is referring to price, because in the video this was posted on, we were talking about the cost to make HBM2 versus GDDR5, where you're talking like $60+ for a 4-high stack HBM2 versus $9-10 for an 8 gigabit per second GDDR5 piece of memory. So I think that's what it's in reference to. The difference is, first of all, let's kind of zoom it out. Actually, this is really convenient and unintentional, but I have a Titan V in front of me here. So let's just zoom it out. Start with the basics. A card like this has HBM2 on it. It's got it surrounding the die on top of the substrate, but technically there's something in between the substrate, and the memory and the die. And that something in between is an interposer. So an interposer is created at the fabrication plants, just like HBM and other dies. Interposers are limited to the same lithography limitations as any other die that you make, so they can only be as big as the largest die that your fabrication plant can make, even though it's not like a memory module or a GPU. It's an interposer that sits under the GPU and the memory modules, and it bridges everything together. It handles all the communication. So you've got this stack of things where you kind of have like PCB with BGA, ball grid array, into the substrate, into interposer, GPU, HBM, all that stuff. Whereas with GDDR memory, your memory would be surrounding the outside of the card. So you end up, I mean, you've all seen it, you end up with memory like this instead. And that's the major difference. That memory is BGA, I think it's 180 ball grid array. And physically, HBM is closer to the GPU, so that's an advantage. You don't deal with as much latency. It's higher bandwidth, as the name would suggest. Now, depending on how many stacks you have, that could be kind of negated. Like running 4 stacks versus 2, for instance, it's kind of like running multiple memory modules on a flash device versus fewer, where you kind of half saturate the amount of channels available. That could limit your bandwidth. If you only used 1 stack of HBM, for example, like the Hades Canyon Nook, you don't have really fully realized benefits of the high bandwidth memory, except for a few. And a few of them are way lower power consumption, pretty low heat flux on HBM2 as well. So you're trying to, cooling HBM is much easier, and power-wise, it uses a lot less power. And I'm not giving numbers because I don't keep them in the top of my head anymore, but if you go to our content that's called, I think it's like how much does HBM cost or how much does Vega cost to make, I went through some of the power metrics there and what the wattage, actual number, numerical wattage differences are, went through the price differences, stuff like that. I would recommend watching that content. It was all in my head at the time we made it. But other things that are different with HBM, they are 3D stacked DRAM dies. So HBM, when I say 4 high, that's referring to kind of how big the stack is vertically. It's kind of like, I don't know, in a way like VNAND or 3D NAND, where you're stacking layers to create the memory. And that's why you end up with, like on a Titan V, with 4 stacks as opposed to 8 individual memory modules as part of it. Density is different too, of course. I think I noted a couple other ones. Interposer yields, so this is interesting too. Some of the cost comes from the yields. Also, the demand for HBM is pretty low right now, relatively. But yields alone, you have your HBM die yield, you have your interposer yield, your GPU yield, and then you have your package yield, which should be high at that point. But the interposer has its own yield, has its own cost. It's like $20, $25 cost. And then you've got your HBM that's in the 60s for a 4 high stack, plus the GPU. And I don't know what those cost, unfortunately. So that's a difference. But yeah, much closer to the GPU, much lower power consumption, vertically stacked, which means that it's smaller. So there's a much smaller footprint on the board. You can make, I mean, I wish they did, but I think that Vega Nano was displayed by AMD a while ago. That's an example of something that would benefit from all of those things. So, but check out our previous content for like a 20-minute detail on it. Next one, Reps Up 100 says GeForce Experience or Radeon ReLive. Is it ReLive? Yes. Yes? I think it's pronounced ReLive. Yeah, so this is just showing how we cover so much stuff that obviously I can't memorize all of it forever. It kind of starts leaving eventually. But ReLive, I liked a lot. We used to use Shadowplay almost exclusively for capturing B-roll of games, gameplay footage, stuff like that. And Shadowplay, I have a lot of problems with now. Yes, I know we just ran ads for it, and it's still decent software. But the thing is, when NVIDIA introduced the registration button, that was kind of a big problem for me, because it used to be with GeForce Experience, I think 2.0 or whatever it was, you just launch it, and you could run Shadowplay. You didn't have to log into anything. There was no bullshit involved. You just launch the thing, you hit Alt F9, and it records your game. And now you need to log into an account, which I really dislike strongly. Clearly they want your email address. Clearly they're doing something with data logging. Whether or not it's malicious, I'm not going to comment. I don't have any reason to believe that it is, but also they're collecting data clearly. So that's not the problem I have with it, though, although I can fully appreciate why you would have that problem. My problem is that it's inconvenient to use, and Shadowplay hasn't been updated at the same pace as ReLive. So ReLive was really surprising to me when it came out. We did a couple of videos on it and compared it to Shadowplay. Overhead for Shadowplay in games, and when I say overhead, I mean, let's say you play a game at 100 FPS and you start recording it. Clearly you expect some loss of performance in frame rate. And typically, if we're talking 100, you would see a dip down to 97 with Shadowplay. You're talking less than 3% on average. ReLive was really damn close to that. I mean, in most cases, it was about the same. And these days, now that it's been updated and improved further, I would expect it's about the same, if not better, than Shadowplay for overhead. So I do really like it. If you have an NVIDIA card, you should probably just stick with Shadowplay. But I don't even know if ReLive works with NVIDIA cards anymore. I know that their previous one, GVR, technically worked with all devices, but that was a Raptor thing that AMD worked with them to bundle it in with one of AMD's software developers. I don't know. It was a big mess. So GVR was pretty messy. But ReLive I like a lot. The software is really good. AMD's done a good job to build their software package in a way that's like much easier to navigate. Really small stuff like navigating folders. With Shadowplay, I don't know if they've updated this recently, but for a while, when you tried to navigate between folders, you couldn't type in a folder path, or even click on like the Windows directory through a normal Windows Explorer dialog. You had to navigate through this stupid custom built-in file tree and dig your way up out of the grave you were in to find the file path you wanted. Whereas with ReLive, you just basically type in a path and you're there. So I really liked ReLive's navigation. I thought it was well designed when it came out. I'm sure it still is. I haven't looked at the updated versions, but I did genuinely like ReLive a lot. And if I could take their navigation, I think that's really the main thing I would want to see Shadowplay improve on. Shadowplay is just fine, functionally as software, they're both great at what they do. It's just one is much better UI and UX than the other, and that's ReLive. So credit to Andy there. Bill Bruce says, Steve, have you ever watched your videos on 0.5 speed?
No. It sounds like torture.
I watch them on like 2x when I'm previewing them before we publish. Next question. Kanamatopia says, how do you feel about people calling you Tech Jesus? I'm not, here's what I want to know. Who started it? Does anyone know who started that? Was it just commenters, or was there a YouTuber who started that? I feel like it might have been Paul and Kyle, but let me know if you specifically know where that came from. Clearly I'm no carpenter, though, if you've seen some of our attempts at wood things. Next one, Reps Up. Oh, I guess you had you in there twice. Reps Up 100. I wonder if Steve would ever be employed by one of the manufacturers in the future. No, not going anywhere. I have zero interest. I have worked for companies in the past. I worked for Dell. It was a good experience, but I'm not really big into the being employed by people thing. I like to kind of do stuff my way. So, no, I mean, yeah, I am not interested in that. I plan to basically stay here forever. So, if you don't like that, I'm sorry. You're stuck with me. That's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Patreon version will be at patreon.com/gamersnexus. And we have lots of cool stuff coming up this week. So, working on most of it tonight, including more stuff with this thing, an IHS. So check back for that. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up our GN Crystal Teardown Cubes and the GN Mod Mat. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.